Welcome to another episode from Weird NZ. Heads up, if you are feeling a bit down today, in need of a pick-me-up, more than a coffee or gin with breakfast, make that a glass of red, you are in the wrong place. You need to listen to a podcast by David Goggins, or a cat video instead. This is one miserable recollection heaped upon the previous miserable recount, and it takes place on what still remains a desolate remote place, 40 kilometre by 12 kilometre volcanic island, a few go to, forgotten, as close as anyone can come to on today's planet Earth for those seeking isolation. This is no balmy island in the tropics from the pages of Robert Louis Stevenson. Forget swaying palm trees. The only treasure there were the seals. They were hunted to near extinction in the early 1800s. The Aucklands, 5 islands, Auckland being by far the largest, sit 500 kilometres south of the mainland of New Zealand, not New Zealand's most southern position. That's 275 kilometres away at the Campbells to the southeast. Just for interest's sake, to prove conclusively, if any more evidence was really necessary, my brain is high needs. I googled the distance between New Zealand's southernmost islands, the Campbells, up to the most northern one, Nugent. Oh God, Nugent. Now I have to go away and listen to A Cat Scratch Fever. Comes back after also listening to Wango Tango. Campbell Islands to Nugent Island, 2,800 kilometres. New Zealand consists of way more than the 3 islands you mostly see on maps. There's 600 of them. Unless you are a rich nature nerd and can afford to go on a charter, a botanist, it's off limit to humans. No one lives there permanently, and just the birds, including penguins, teals, snipes, and
yeah, baby,
shags. Good so far. Now to the weather. Oh, the weather. The forecast for the next 7 days I looked up as at the 1st of April. No, it's no April Fool's prank. 6 days of off and on rain at some point, one day fine. High of 11 degrees on one occasion, mostly around 8 during the day, dropping to 2 at night. Relentless cold winds averaging 35 kilometres per hour, up to 55 some days. That's a moderate gale on the Beaufort scale. If this hasn't deterred you getting a tourist brochure, then there's the surrounding oceans. A temperature is 7 degrees Celsius. You'll need to pack more than Speedos if you were wanting to go for a dip. Only there's not a lot of places to enjoy the beach life on Auckland Island. Sheer rock walls present a challenge for anyone wanting to get off and onto the rocky beaches. The treacherous oceans surrounding the Aucklands made it a graveyard for sailing ships in the 1800s, when navigation minus the sun and stars was a haphazard affair. A stone's throw from here, the largest ever recorded natural wave, was a happening thing, 24 metres. Yet all these winds and waves weren't the main dangers to ancient mariners. Fog. When it doesn't blow, those cold waters meant the island is often enveloped in fog. It was these exact foggy conditions that led to the 1,100-tonne Invercauld powering into the northwestern part of the Auckland Island on the 11th of May 1864. The shit show began the moment the 25 on board heard the wooden hull grind onto the rocks. The ship didn't sink straight away and broke up slowly whilst the crew ran about like chooks with their head cut off. At the very time they needed a clear level-headed leadership from the Scottish captain and his first mate, there came no such orders. There were no commands. to grab what you can, launch the 3 lifeboats. By the time it became apparent the ship was going beneath the surface, it was every man for himself, a swim for it. It being the rocky beach 150 metres away. One of those that couldn't swim for it, because he had a broken limb, was simply left to drown. 19 of the 26 drowned rat-looking sailors made it to shore. I should have mentioned the vessel had no passengers, no cargo as well, on its journey between Melbourne and Peru. Head-scratching to think, given the perilous nature of sailing at the time. There were sailors who couldn't swim, yet sadly that was the case. Such was the shambles of the abandonment. Most of the 19 who made it to shore arrived minus their shoes, those having been jettisoned to stay afloat. Interesting factoid, people round that era, they only learnt to breaststroke or sidestroke. What we now call freestyle didn't become the dominant swimming stroke for a good 3 more decades. That's why the first English Channel crossing was completed breaststroke. At this point I will introduce an important point about the narrative. What we know happened for the next year and a bit is down to the survivors. The ambivalent Captain George Delgado, a sailor Robert Holding, who penned a book from his perspective, the first mate Andrew Smith. Most of the reliable stuff comes from Holding, and that was all written from the safety of civilization. The 2 highest ranking people on board, the Invercauld, Delgado and Smith, tried their best to whitewash their less than stellar fortitude when it hit the fan. Putting aside the vessel sailing into the rocky outcrop, 6 other vessels would do the same, the last one in 1907. It wasn't for the lack of navigation. The prime reason why 19 sailors now found themselves in a perilous predicament, shoeless, clueless, cold, wet, and with just 2 pounds of biscuits, a few pieces of pork, rescued for food, was all down to the initial lack of leadership from both Delgado and Smith. That wouldn't change, only get worse as starvation and weather sapped energy. With it, the will to live. Delgado's dereliction would continue throughout the coming months. Smith did have some gumption, way less though than Holding. To the point, Holding rapidly developed into the de facto leader of the survivors. His leadership immediately came to the fore, even as the crew took toll of their plight alone on the beach. Thankfully, some people, or most people, smoked back then. 2 packets of wet matches were rescued. One of them was given to Smith, and then he gave them to the ship's cook to dry out. After wasting half the packet to finally get one to light, he then put them beside the fire to dry out. And what happened to them? Well, guess what? They all went up in flames. Smith was about to give the remaining packet to the cook when Holding snatched them from his hand, preserving their most precious resource. Now huddling under the cliff, they did what? Nothing. For company, they looked out to sea and had the stark reminder how close the Grim Reaper was. In the form of a corpse of one of the 4 crewmen who had drowned, he was suspended like a grisly scarecrow in the stern rigging, the only part of the Invercauld visible above the waters. With all their meagre rescued food gone, they sent a scouting party up the cliff, and on their return, they reported it was better on top. They all went up. Well, not technically all of them. One of the original search party had fallen down the cliff and badly injured himself. They left him to die. I have to add here, dark thoughts were already been discussed, only a week in. The realisation that gradual starvation was the likely outcome. Talk of cannibalism was already in the air. For the lower ranks and the ship boys, overhearing this talk, they knew who was most likely to be the first one on the main course. 4 of those lower ranks bolted rather than be eaten, and were never seen again. In the boggy open to the winds, tussock lands, they struck gold in the form of a pig. pigs, goats and rabbits having been introduced deliberately in 1840 for just such a predicament by Sir James Ross. Light bulbs may glow upon hearing Ross dependency and Ross C. Yep, him. Motley vegetables, similarly planted as food source for castaways, were also to be found, only they literally never took root and became inedible. Unbeknownst to this crew, this survival story wasn't the only one going on the Auckland Islands. A similar one was happening in the south, vessel Grafton. That pig was, needless to say, scoffed in short order. It was now only a week into the marooning, and it was already beginning to unravel. The chain of command was breaking down. The general consensus was to make it to Port Ross on the other side of the island, where there was a greater chance of being rescued, locating possible civilization. This was a haphazard affair, and not everyone was on board with this plan. 3 decided they would just go south, only to find that the going was too tough and returned to the straggling group, 1 short. The cook, he simply decided to curl up under some tussock and let nature take its course. Holding went ahead on his own and found what he considered to be more survivable setup, ate his fill of limpets which he cooked on a fire, then tramped back through the deep mud and bogs to the rest of the crew moping about in a rata forest, existing only on roots and water now. And the bedraggled survivors arrived on the east coast, minus 2 sailors who had simply succumbed to the cold and hunger. But at least that was the story. One could imagine a more horrid fate. The initial thoughts of many was they had jumped out of the fry pan and into the fire. Their new location was worse than what they had come from in terms of resources and shelter. They decided simply to go back to the west coast and take their chances there. Since there was nothing stopping them, they marched off and were never seen again. Things were now getting desperate for the dwindling survivors. The fatigued Delgano's orders were now falling on deaf ears, and taking toll of the situation, Holding marshalled Smith and the other stronger members and went out in 2 groups to look for food and permanent shelter, leaving behind the weaker troop, including the captain. A temporary reprieve came in the form of limpets on the beach and small fish in tidal pools. Then, joy of joys, they killed a seal. This was a finite resource though, not enough to prevent another 4 dying. Then it looked like they'd struck gold when berries were found, and what was left of an abandoned settlement called Hardwicke. Note on my YouTube channel Interesting Things, FINGZ, I've done a video on the doomed settlement of Hardwicke, more at the end and in the description. By the time the sailors from the Invercauld arrived into what was left of Hardwicke, the place was a ghost town. The weather had laid ruin to all but 1 house. Still, 1 decent shelter was better than none. A bonus was the ability to accrue some leftover cooking utensils and cutlery left behind a decade prior. This, you would have thought, would have been the turning point for the better. They had for the first time a base out of the wind and rain, a stream nearby with watercress. Nope. As the weeks rolled into months, lethargy set in. The weather remained consistent. Delgano and Smith began ordering everyone around to do all the grunt work whilst they sat by the fire. Backstabbing and resentment broke out. And to add to the psychological warfare, there was also a misguided optimistic belief that there were clear signs of human occupation, and that automatically meant a vessel must pop by now and again, wait long enough, and they would all be rescued. As time went on, it required longer and longer time to forage, and it became questionable as if the energy consumed gathering food and wood was all worth the effort. Then there were the groups that didn't want to be Delgano and Smith's lackeys. They scraped together enough material to build their own shelters away from the others, eat and burn what their efforts obtained rather than share it. For one of those groups, appearing, This attempt to fend for themselves didn't work out that well, to put it rather mildly. One of them hadn't been seen in a while, and further investigations led to his corpse, which had been picked over. That was the sound effect for the highly nutritious organs. Now let's give it a spin for the thighs. Nine months in, they were now whittled down to just 5 or 7, depending on who you listen to. Hardwicke was now becoming a warmer place to starve to death. With no seals or ships in sight, they headed north, camped in primitive thatch huts, looking for untapped food sources. Let me repeat what I mentioned before regarding the recorded history. All protagonists inflated their roles. The three recollections do differ, and Delgado and Smith's tended to be this person died and not how they died. If the rest of the crew got stuck into prime buttocks, they never uttered a word. Holding's story may have been much bravado. We will never really know. One thing we do know is Robert Holding didn't only put his survival down to simple nous. The Englishman said, "It was because I'm fat." He had packed on the pounds in Australia before picking up work on the Invercauld there. On the topic of fat, seals were becoming their one and only food source that would allow them to supply their body with sustenance and fend off the cold. Only most of the seals were now off doing their own hunting out at sea. There was one place, though, tantalisingly close, Rose Island, where they could be observed lounging about on the beach. Rose Island, by my calculations, is only about 600 metres from the north-eastern coast, close to their new base. Holding constructed a primitive one-man boat out of sealskins, a coracle of sorts, picking the right sea and weather, paddled across. To his delight, he found not just seals. The small island was infested with rabbits. Paddled back to tell the other 2 survivors. That's right. We are now down to 3, the main characters. Going back to Hardwicke, they decided to construct a far more sturdy craft to get them all across to Rose from the timbers left there. Only the first one they built on the beach got washed away in a storm. The second one was constructed even stronger, and away they rode with their meagre possessions, mostly what they'd scavenged in the ruins of the ghost town. A veritable Salvation Army op-shop range of dead men's clothing. It was rosier on Rose. They could knock off the odd seal now and again, worked out a system of catching the wily rabbits, built primitive thatch huts. Delgado and Smith insisted they squat separately in their own hovels away from a mere seaman like Holding. 1 year and 1 week after their vessel was smashed onto the rocks, the 20th of May 1865, salvation in the form of a Portuguese ship, the Julian, came into view. The Julian parked up in the harbour. This was in itself rather fortuitous. The Julian had sprung a leak and was in need of repairs. Most sensible captains gave the Auckland a wide berth. Off they all sailed to Callao in Peru. They weren't out of the woods though. An influenza outbreak was ravaging their ride to safety. It took 2 lives. Not our 3 though. If you ever get to Lima, go on a port tour and visit the Marine Museum at Callao, spelt Kallao. The captain's bare bones report was first to appear in print in newspapers, and then the first mate elaborated somewhat more. Holding's book, Wake of Invercauld, became a bestseller. If you get bored listening to the murder ballads by Nick Cave, Wake of Invercauld is still in print today. Robert Holding ended up emigrating to Canada. May I suggest an untold poster boy for modern day advocates of intermittent dieting, ketosis, because he lived till 93. The same could also be said for Captain George Delgado. He lived another 25 years as well, dying in his hometown in Scotland. Smith, I'm not too sure where he ended up. By the way, when Garno's report was first issued, the Australian government immediately sent a steamer to try and locate if there were any other survivors from the groups and individuals who had gone their own way. No remains were ever found, just the bodies of those buried in and around Hardwicke. Well, what was left of them. The good money is on that there were more than one instances of cannibalism. If you're watching or listening to this on YouTube, I will leave you with the story of the failed settlement of Hardwicke. We'll try and also put a link in podcast descriptions as well. Who knows if that'll work. The doomed settlement of Hardwicke on Auckland Island is an adult version of The Lord of the Flies, mixed with lashings of hard liquor. Thanks for listening to and at Weird NZ, supporting my low-tech study room production. I will spot you next time. Let's go out on the juicy calves, eh? Bye for now.